Well, first of all, thanks for being here. I have the impression that this might be one of the, let's say, most non-technical talks of this whole conference. So thanks for sticking to this one. I will not go into any kind of technical details, but I want to talk about vulnerabilities and basically about, let's say, how to deal with vulnerabilities in terms of how to maybe sell them, how to make money out of it. Just to give an impression which kind of, let's say, possibilities you have and which are the actual advantages and the drawbacks. So for those of you who want to have a deep technical, let's say, session on vulnerabilities, sorry, there is nothing in here for you. If you want to know something about the vulnerability market and, let's say, possibilities to actually extort kind of money out of vulnerabilities, well, then you're right. So first things first, my name is Udo Schneider. I'm a security evangelist with Trend Micro, and part of my role is this kind of, let's say, mixture between technical and business-related stuff. So yes, I do have a technical background, and I do like hacking my free time, but that's not part of my official role. So let's start with something simple. Let's say, just for a minute, that you discovered a vulnerability, a zero-day vulnerability remotely exploitable in Windows. I mean, there are a few of them, but let's just take this as an idea. So you found something, or somebody you know found something. What's your first reaction? What's your first thing that you might think of to do? Well, depending on whether you are wearing black, gray, or white hats, your first reaction might be, well, let's just tell it to the vendor. Dear Mr. Vendor, there is a vulnerability within your code. Good idea. Just one little caveat. Depending on who you're talking to, this might be a pretty bad idea. Because some vendors do not like being informed about vulnerabilities. So I just picked up a few examples. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't want to do any blaming here. It's just a random choice of a few reactions that vendors had when they were notified of a vulnerability. The first one is from PwC, and basically what happened is that somebody found a vulnerability in their internal applications. And the reaction was, well, nice that you found that vulnerability, but if you're going to release it, we're going to sue you. So the first response that they got was actually, do not publish the vulnerability, otherwise you will be in big trouble. Reason for that one, at least that's the reason that PwC brought up, was, well, this is an internal application that you shouldn't have had access in the first place. So this is kind of forbidden. So everything that you found out of that forbidden action by finding this internal application is illegal as well. So don't publish that vulnerability. It's quite interesting. If you read the article, you will see that their internal applications leaked to the internet, so they were not as internal as they thought. But still, this was one of the reactions. If you're going to release it, we're going to sue you. But it even gets better. Even if a vendor has a bug bounty program, in some cases, they only want to hear bugs that are covered by their program. This is a pretty good example where the bug bounty program was for the actual firmware of the drones, and somebody found a vulnerability in their website and told them. And the reaction was, well, this vulnerability is not covered by the bug bounty program. Again, if you're going to release it, if you're going to disclose it, you will be in big trouble. And this kind of repeats itself. By the way, this is quite an interesting read. There is a pretty long paper on this one with all the details explaining why the researcher effectively walked away from around about $30,000 US of bounty just because he was, sorry for the French, pissed off because the first answer he got was, if you're going to release it, we're going to sue you. And this is not just limited to non-IT companies. By the way, if you are working or if you're dealing with let's say, non-IT, especially non-IT security companies. For instance, one of my main topics at the moment is industrial security, so all those PLC, HMI vendors, they haven't heard anything about responsible disclosure. Their first reaction, if you tell them, well, there is a vulnerability within your code, you will get a call back from the legal department. So even if you're a security vendor, the first reaction might be, well, the vulnerability that you found isn't really a vulnerability. If you're going to release it, you will be in big trouble. We're going to sue you. And if you take these examples, it's quite understandable that actually some researchers are, sorry for the French, are kind of pissed off and start releasing zero-day exploits via Twitter, via Pastebin, via GitHub. And Sandbox Escaper has made it to some fame right now. He or she released a few Windows zero-day exploits within the last year and a half. I think the last one was 2 weeks ago. Basically, the summary of the tweets are, here's another zero-day exploits, Microsoft, do your job. I don't care anymore. I don't want to deal with the hostile behavior when disclosing vulnerabilities. So to make a long story short, if you do find a vulnerability, one possibility is to actually, let's say, disclose it to the vendor, but be prepared that some vendors do not actually like being notified of vulnerabilities. So that's your first choice. This one's the pure white hacker approach. I found a vulnerability, I want to do something good to the public, let's disclose the vulnerability. Okay, let's just turn it around. If the good way doesn't work, let's say if the light side doesn't work, let's go for the dark side. Let's try to sell our vulnerability in the underground. You know, quite funny, if you take a look at stock photos of hackers, you will find, let's say, guys in hoodies, no girls, by the way, which is a pity, always sitting in front of a monitor, just being illuminated by the monitor and trying to hack something. Don't get me started. So let's sell it in the underground. Let's make big money there. Well, the truth is, there is no big money to be made by selling something, at least vulnerabilities, and or exploit code in the underground. If you take a look, let's say, from the business perspective, you will see that most of the, let's say, used exploits in common malware and common exploit kits are kind of, let's call them antique. So you will find exploits targeting Flash Player. You will find exploits targeting Internet Explorer version 5 or 6, so pretty antique stuff, and still it works. And that's the point where you have to think, let's say, from a business perspective. If you want to make money out of your customers, victims, then you want to actually, let's say, invest as less as possible and at the same time get the highest return of investment. And now do yourself a favor. Let's talk about those zero-day exploits that are going around in the media. The typical cost, and we'll cover this one in a moment, the typical cost of a zero-day exploit is something like 30,000, 100,000, up to 2 or 3 million US dollars. So if you are a common cyber criminal, if you want to make money, is there any financial sense in buying a zero-day exploit for, let's say, $100,000, risking that this exploit might be burned after first use? When compared, if you use an exploit kit which still uses the old stuff, you will still get a lot of infections and new victims. So from a pure financial perspective, it doesn't make sense to use, let's say, new zero-day exploits in exploit kits because it doesn't make sense from a financial point of view. Don't get me wrong, if a zero-day exploit is discovered, if it's disclosed, you can be quite sure that if it's effective, it will be one of those exploit kits in a matter of hours. But buying the exploit doesn't make sense, at least not for those guys. The other point is the, let's say, effectiveness of exploit kits is going down rapidly. If you take a look at current numbers, you will see a decrease in something like 70 to 80%, let's say, infection rates through exploit kits. Exploit kits were born at a time where, let's say, most of the victims had some kind of similar setup. Most had Windows XP, Windows 7. It was a pretty small range of used web browsers, of used plugins, things like that. So you had a pretty homogeneous target audience as an exploit kit vendor. And therefore, the actual infection rates were quite high. Now, fast forward to today. If you take a look how people actually are browsing the web today, some of them are using Windows, some of them are using Macs, an Android phone, an iOS phone, an Android tablet, a Windows tablet. So it's a pretty heterogeneous environment right now. Therefore, the actual effectiveness of exploit kits decreased. So we have two factors. The first one is the exploit kits still work pretty well with this old, boring, antique stuff, and exploit kits in general are decreasing. From a security standpoint, this makes kind of sense to say, well, there is one very, very, very effective way to prevent infections using exploit kits, and that's patching. It's simple patching. The single most effective way to provide security, if there is just one thing that you're actually doing, it's patching your systems. Because yes, there are those zero-day exploits floating around in the media, but the truth is, in reality, most of those exploit kits, most of the malware is using pretty old, already patched stuff. So that's selling this whole stuff in the underground. Okay, so let's say going white didn't work. Going black didn't work. Let's try gray. I'm pretty sure that most of you are aware of vulnerability brokers. So there are companies out there buying exploits. And there are a few of them out there, but I just picked two because those two actually issued press releases, issued financial statements detailing how much money they are willing to spend on exploits. Actually, they have a price list on their website detailing which exploit might be worth which amount of money. So the first one is CROWDFENSE. It's a vulnerability broker based out of the UAE, so the United Arabian Emirates. And the funny thing is they actually issued a press release where they said, well, this was in 2017, we just got our first round of financing. We collected $10 million for buying vulnerabilities. Right now, I double-checked yesterday again, they announced on the website that they have their second or third round of financing, I think it's the second one, collecting another $15 million for buying exploits. And the nice thing about CROWDFENSE is the fact that you will get kind of a price list. You can exactly see how much an exploit, a zero-day exploit, is worth. So if you find, let's say for iOS, a zero interaction remote code execution with privilege escalation, it will give you something like up to $3 million. So if you find something like that in a recent iOS device, no user interaction, remote code execution, including privilege escalation, you can get up to $3 million. There are several other smaller prices. So, for instance, Android in some cases is a bit cheaper. Windows was cheaper in the past, but this could give you some idea what actually, what's on the table if you have such a vulnerability, if you have the actual working exploit code. And the process that they're offering is quite simple. If you find something, you can contact them. So you will be, let's say, part of their research community. You basically have to prove that your exploit works. Then you can start negotiating what's the actual price for that exploit will be. And if CROWDFENSE decides to actually buy the exploit, you will hand over the, let's say, exploit code, you will get the money, and everybody's happy. So that's the short story. That's how to make $3 million US dollars. And CROWDFENSE is not the only one. There is another player, for instance, Zerodium. By the way, I really like their way of putting the different exploits in some kind of PSE, but different story. So they have kind of a similar price range. So if you have something like, let's say, a zero-day exploit or an exploit targeting iOS, no user interaction, privilege escalation, or they call it local privilege escalation or elevation, then you're up to, I'm not quite sure if I can read it, but I think it's in the 2.5 to 3 million range as well. They have a pretty nice list of different kind of applications that they target, including different, let's say, back-end systems like Apache, Elasticsearch, Struts, Hadoop, things like that. So they have a real kind of price list. If you find something, tell us. Maybe we can get some kind of agreement. We will buy the exploit and everybody's happy. Same process here. You basically contact them. But by the way, everything I'm showing here is public on the website. There is nothing hidden or stolen. It's the marketing pitch that they are using. So once again, if you find something, contact them, prove that you can do what you announced to do, negotiate a nice price, and go home with a lot of money. Are you missing something? These are the disclosure processes of Zerodium and CROWDFENSE. And there is one thing that I'm actually missing. Nowhere in this process will CROWDFENSE or Zerodium disclose the vulnerability to the vendor, because that's their business model. Their business model is buying exploits and reselling them for a very high price. And if you take a look at their target customer list, the kind of audiences that they want to address, well, it's mainly law enforcement. It's agencies. So basically, they are buying those exploits as, let's call it, as a weapon. And they do not intend to disclose the vulnerability to the vendor. And let's say, turn back time for a year and a half, think about Eternal Blue, think about WannaCry. What happened, or what happens for a vulnerability that's maybe able to penetrate 90+% of connected Windows PCs, which is able to execute code on these PCs without any kind of protection. Think WannaCry. Think NotPetya or Petya. So basically what happens here is that those vulnerabilities are being sold, are being bought, and are kept hidden, are kept under disclosure, because they want to resell those vulnerabilities, which basically means everybody of us remains more insecure because the vulnerabilities are still in the code, can still be exploited, are not disclosed to the vendor. And sorry for the French, that's the point that pisses me off. Because, I mean, security is always some kind of double-edged sword. If you are working in a security environment, you want to, let's say, make, and this might sound cheesy, but you want to make the world more secure for everybody. And that's not the definition of making the world secure for anybody. So my point here, and if there is just one point that you're taking out of this talk is, if you find a vulnerability, please do me the favor. of either disclose it to the vendor, or if you don't want to deal with the vendor, use one of several open, let's say, disclosure programs. You can go through Facebook, you can go through Project Zero, you can go through your local CERT, but do not, please do not sell your vulnerability if you find something to, let's call it, official vulnerability brokers, because that basically means that this vulnerability will be kept hidden, which makes everything more insecure for all of us. And I just want to give you an insight because, I mean, working for Trend Micro, I have my own interest in promoting the zero-day initiative. Let me just show you what we're actually doing, because there are several, let's say, bug bounty or disclosure programs where you can send in your vulnerability for free. Project Zero actually is buying vulnerabilities. So if you want to make some money out of it, there is still the possibility to, let's say, remain white and still make money out of it. So ZDI basically is a collection of researchers with, let's say, which are situated worldwide, which do collect, discover, and disclose vulnerabilities through ZDI. So ZDI is basically buying those vulnerabilities, and I have to admit, we are not paying $3 million for a zero-day iOS exploit. I think last year we paid out something like $1.5 million. So if you know, for instance, if you know Pwn to Own, that's a zero-day initiative event. The last event that they did, they actually made a cooperation with Tesla, the automotive maker, and Tesla said, well, if somebody of your guys succeeds in hacking the car, he can keep the car. So now we have two guys with a new Tesla, but different story. So we are actually providing the front end for you to submit vulnerabilities. We are buying them, actually. But the important thing is we disclose those vulnerabilities as well to the vendor. And we're talking about a lot of vulnerabilities. If we're talking about 2018, we're talking about roughly 1,400 vulnerabilities that were disclosed through ZDI. That's an increase of, I think, 42% compared to 2017. Over the whole lifetime of ZDI, something like 5,500, roughly, vulnerabilities. And the one thing that makes me sad is, I hope you can see it, of those 1,444 vulnerabilities, 158 were disclosed as a zero-day, which basically means that we got the vulnerability, we informed the vendor, we disclosed the vulnerability to the vendor, and the vendor didn't react or didn't come up with a patch. So once we inform the vendor, this clock starts ticking, and after 60, 90, 120 days, depending on the vertical, we're going to release it. That's something that we're going to tell the vendor as well. If you don't react, we will release that vulnerability. And 158 of those were released without the vendor either giving any kind of response or trying to sue us, which, by the way, it's kind of funny. We like being sued because we didn't lose a single case up to now. So if you don't want to risk getting sued, just tell us, and we like getting sued. But the point is, and that's the most important point here, is everything that you're disclosing through ZDI is being disclosed to the vendor as well. Just to give an impression how the different, let's say, vendors are affected. Of course, we're getting a lot for Microsoft. We're getting a lot for Apple. What's quite funny is we actually bought Tipping Point and ZDI, and you can see this was then ZDI starting to take a look at Trend Micro's own product. This didn't went well with the board, but well, that's what they're doing. Still, those vulnerabilities were disclosed and fixed. But you can see how the different vendors or how the different verticals are affected. And I just want to give you an, let's say, insight into the actual disclosure process. So first of all, if you submit a vulnerability to ZDI, then after we get the vulnerability, after we get the exploit, you get your money, by the way, we are actually disclose that vulnerability to the vendor. And that's one of the first steps after we get the exploit, get the vulnerability, and after we have confirmed that it actually works. So there is no keeping away vulnerabilities from the vendor. It's all disclosed. However, and that's, let's say that's the commercial side right now, ZDI and Trend Micro, we are providing what we call a so-called digital vaccine. So we provide a virtual patch for that vulnerability. And we are providing that virtual patch to our customers. And no, I don't want to, let's say, convince you of buying Trend Micro. It's just, I want to show you why we are giving away money to buy vulnerabilities. Because yes, we do buy vulnerabilities, we do spend the money. However, our benefit is selling better and more products to our customers with a, let's say, earlier protection. So that's basically our benefit. So in this case, everybody benefits because the vulnerability is getting sold, is getting bought. So the one who's finding the vulnerability will get his money. We have the advantage of being able to provide protection earlier, and still the vendor is being informed about the vulnerability. And then the regular, let's say, disclosure process starts. So basically, if there is any kind of a vendor response, then we do kind of coordinate the disclosure, especially if you're a vendor, let's say, in the ICS area, so IoT, industrial, things like that. Some of them ask us to delay the actual publication date because they have to fix, I don't know, 10,000 machines out in the field, but that's something that we can talk about. So the worst reaction is to not respond at all. But however, I said most vendors nowadays do respond. So the vulnerability might be fixed, might be addressed, might be documented. That's something that we have to negotiate with the vendor. However, after a specific time, the vulnerability will be released. And that's basically our advantage. The one who's finding the vulnerability will get the money. The vendor is getting notified, and we have this let's say, this time advantage of being able to provide protection earlier. So there is nobody here, let's say, losing anything. In average, and that's a number from 2017, I think it's something like 70 or 72 days in average that we provided protection earlier than others. So that's our benefit. So to make a long story short, if we are talking about black hats, white hats, gray hats, I don't like those terms, by the way. We have to differentiate between who's the good guy or gal, the bad and the ugly. The worst thing, in my personal opinion, that you can do is find something which is per se not bad and resell it either to somebody in the underground, which is pretty likely, as we've just seen, due to, let's say, financial reasons. But the second worst thing is selling it to a vulnerability broker which does not disclose the vulnerability to the vendor. Because once again, this means that the vulnerability will remain in the code, will remain exploitable, and makes everything more insecure for everybody of us. If you choose to, let's say, disclose it directly, if you like the legal fun, you can try to disclose it, let's say, on your own. And just to be honest, I showed you some pretty bad examples of disclosure policies. Other vendors are much better in handling vulnerabilities and exploits. So if you contact them, they are much more open, they are much more used to the process of handling submissions of vulnerabilities. But there are also some pretty bad examples. So either, and that's my plea at that point, either disclose the vulnerability to the vendor, and if you don't like the, let's say, the legal hassle, if you don't like the administrative overwork, if you don't like the, let's say, the administrative effort to disclose it to the vendor, please, please, please disclose it through a maybe third-party bug bounty or CERT program. Check your local CERT, check other organizations, and use them as some kind of proxy to disclose the vulnerability. Of course, I would be happy if you take the vulnerability and offer it to Zero Day Initiative, because that would give us the possibility to basically provide a better protection for our customers. But at the end of the day, if I have the choice, if somebody's asking me, Udo, if you have the choice, submitting it, let's say, to a to CROWDFENSE or to Zerodium, so one of those vulnerability brokers, versus submitting it to a third-party bug bounty program, so that Trend Micro has nothing to gain out of it, I would say, well, go for the bug bounty program. I don't care if it's, let's say, if it's Google, if it's Facebook, if it's CERT, if it's Secunia, whatever. But please, please, please disclose it so that the public will, or that the vendor will learn of it. As I said, I would be happy if it's Trend Micro's Project Zero, not Project Zero, Zero Day Initiative, sorry, too many acronyms, but still, and that's my plea at that point. As I said, that's not technical. Please, please, please stay away from those brokers who do not disclose the vulnerability. And that should be everything from my side. I hope you don't mind that we kept that a bit short, because I just wanted to, if possible, open the floor for discussions and or questions. So first of all, thank you very much, and I think we're open to questions, aren't we? If there are any.
Do you know how those brokers make sure that the same vulnerability is not sold to them or give out to bug bounties or kind of reuse? Like, if they don't disclose to vendor, is there any chance of them even learning that the same thing was sold many times?
Yes and no. So what actually happens is they try to imply some kind of trust into them. So they say, well, dear researcher, if you found a vulnerability, well, you have to trust us. You cannot sell it to anybody else. So there are legal implications, there are contracts, but at the end of the day, there is nothing for them to technically prevent reselling the same exploit to, let's say, several of those hunters. Still, those guys and gals, they talk to each other, so you can be pretty sure if you sell the same exploit, let's say, to CROWDFENSE or previously to Wupin or to Kevin Mitnick, whatever, that they know each other. So you're doing it maybe once, but not twice or three times. So there is no technical limitation to do so. I mean, you can't prevent somebody from copying the exploit or copying the intellectual property, but still there are, let's say, legal implications, there are contracts, and they know each other, they talk to each other. By the way, this scenario is, I don't want to say it's quite common, but it's not uncommon that the same vulnerability is discovered by multiple people. So we had the case that, this was quite interesting. If you take a look at the hacking history, you could actually see that some of those exploits were sold to hacking team and later on rediscovered, in quotes, rediscovered, and let's say disclosed through Project Zero or through Zero Day Initiative. But still, it's not quite sure if that's the same person or if it's just, let's say, the same discovery. But as I said, there is no way to prevent it. It's just, they tell you you have to trust them, and please, please, please don't resell it to others. Anybody else? Cool. So, sure. Mm-hmm.
Last year. How much you can predict if this in general, I mean, disclosed to some other, like brokers or vendors in general?
I can't talk about the number of exploits that were, let's say, disclosed to brokers, because they don't give us numbers, actually.
Yeah, but you can just...
Yeah. So the overall number of vulnerabilities, I think ZDI was in the range of, I'm not quite sure, I think 45% of all vulnerabilities that were disclosed. So you can maybe double that or triple that to have round about the number of vulnerabilities that were disclosed publicly. The number of vulnerabilities disclosed to, let's say, to those brokers can be kind of interfered because you know, for instance, that CrowdFence had $10 million of fund. They were funded with $10 million. You see, for instance, that an iOS zero-day exploit is roughly 2.5 to 3 million. So you can guess it's a ballpark of, let's say, 4 to 5 high-profile exploits. So let's say Android, zero interaction, remote code execution, maybe combined with roughly 10, 15 to 20, let's say, smaller exploits. Things like exploiting Word, exploiting struts, exploiting Hadoop. So ballpark, I would say, that's really let's say, a guesstimated gut feeling, 20, 25 exploits.
So just a few
Ballpark, yeah. A few very ugly and not or undisclosed vulnerabilities. And to be honest, that's the point that kind of gets me angry because we see what could have happened with Eternal Blue. I mean, WannaCry was a bad piece of malware, to be honest. I mean, everything that should work didn't. But still, imagine a well-made malware with Eternal Blue. So not WannaCry, which didn't work, but something that actually worked. And all of those exploits that are bought by those guys have the potential to be the next Eternal Blue. Think of let's say, remote code execution exploit in Android, zero interaction. I'm just sending you a text, I'm just sending you a link. You don't have to do anything, I'm just sending you a notification, and I'm rooting your device. That's my definition of ugly. Sorry.
Do you know how much Israel pays for that? I mean, the broker, they take 3 million, they give you 3 million. How much they get? More or less, how much do they get from agents?
You mean the one that...
Let's say one of the brokers pays for the exploit like $3 million. How much do they, for how much do they resell it?
If you take a look at the overall numbers, and that's something that you can, again, where I'm quite happy that hacking team happened, because for hacking team you could see how much they paid for the exploits and how much they resold the exploit for. It's easily a factor, let's say 15 to 25 on a yearly basis. Yearly, because you don't buy the exploit, you buy a service. So from a business perspective, it's quite nice. From a moral perspective, not so.
So they are not selling the information, the code to the agencies, they are selling their services to write application or something like that?
Now let's put it that way. If you are a law enforcement agency, so not a, let's say, intelligence agency, you can buy a service from them, I mean, or let's say brokers afterwards, that you will get, let's say basically it's a command control server, which allows you to infect and let's say do surveillance on victims. And you will buy that service. That's not something that Zerodium or CrowdFence are doing. They're not offering the service on their own. So they are reselling those vulnerabilities, but as a service. But those law enforcement agencies, they will get the service. If you are a let's say government agency, then few of them are buying from brokers like them, and most of them are doing their own thing. Anything else? Cool. So thank you very much for sticking with me. Although I assume that this was the most non-technical session at all.